Hello, everyone. This is our second tax chat in the new tax chat series on transforming tax administration, race and tax administration, how issues of racial justice are fundamental to a rights-based tax system. And I am the executive director for the Center for Taxpayer Rights. And I just want to say that I'm very excited to be here today. We have a great panel, and just to place this in context of what's gone before and what's going afterwards, this is a 4-part chat series. We had our original chat on racialized burdens within organizations. And for those of you who haven't seen it, the video of the chat and resource materials are up on a webpage that we'll put in our chat. So that you all can go back, watch it again, see some reference materials. And we'll do the same for this chat. And we also have, for this chat, on that very same page, a number of articles, law review articles, websites, etc., that folks can see and look up to really further research some of the topics that are discussed today. And then in the month of May, we will have 2 more programs, one on racial disparity in tax administration beyond audits. So that's looking at collection and ITINs and also in litigation in the tax court. And then the final one will wrap up with racial disparity in audit selection. And there we'll discuss the recent study by IRS and Stanford showing racial disparity in audit selection. And we'll also report out the results of some ethnographic interviews that were conducted on behalf of the center with taxpayers, low-income taxpayers who are experiencing problems with the IRS, and then our nationwide survey of low-income taxpayers, which we're getting, which is now being tabulated right now and was conducted during the filing season of 2024. So there's lots of information that's going forward. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Les, who will sort of set out maybe a little bit of the context, but also, you know, how to use this chat and that kind of format. So Les, you want to talk for a bit?
Sure. Thanks so much, Nina. And it's good to see everyone, some old friends and some new faces. And we're really fortunate today to have Professor Alice Thomas, who's going to be moderating this panel, which is going to be looking at issues in international tax and tax-exempt organizations. And Alice, who's been teaching at Howard for some time, and also had extensive practice experience in international tax and tax-exempt area. So she's really, and as Alice is a dear colleague of mine on the board of the Center for Taxpayer Rights. So we're fortunate to all be here today. And as Nina mentioned, we have a chat feature. So feel free to enter some questions if you have any, and I'll be, I and Alice will be looking at the chat and making sure we have an opportunity to present the questions to the panelists. And we'll have some time reserved at the end for questions as well. So feel free to raise them. And without much ado, let's turn it to Alice to get us off on I know it's going to be a really interesting and dynamic conversation today. So Alice, welcome.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Les, very much for the introduction, and to all who joined us today for this very exciting afternoon, this panel. We have 3 panelists who have joined us. One is from the nonprofit space. His name is Mr. Malik Ahmed. And in the interest of time, I've asked each one of our panelists to kind of introduce themselves to you, so we don't have to repeat ourselves too much. Then we have Professor David Brennen, who used to be Dean at the University of Kentucky. He also is one of the founders of the nonprofit Tax Law Blog, and he's at University of Florida, I believe, right now. So we're blessed to have him as well. And then Professor Stephen Dean, who's the more internationalist. He does international law. He'll give us an understanding of how these topics intersect in the international space. But we're going to have about 15 minutes for each panelist. And I'm going to ask you to hold your questions as we go through these panelists, and then get prepared to ask your questions in the chat. And if for any reason your question hasn't been asked, raise your hand or just go off mute and ask your question. And we'll be very flexible with each other and make this happen so we can get all questions in before we end this opportunity today. So again, I'm Professor Alice Thomas from Howard Law School, and I'm welcoming to all of you. And so I'll start with Mr. Ahmed. So Mr. Ahmed, you want to start the conversation? Your 15 minutes?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much, Alice and Nina, for bringing us all together. And also, I want to just say to the audience, there may be a few technical glitches where my voice will go in and out. So please try to bear with that and get the gist of what I will say. As Alice said, I'm Malik Ahmed. I am the founder and the former Chief Executive Officer of Better Family Life, a community development, a holistic community development corporation that is now in its 41st year. I was told to talk about some of the experiences that I have encountered and the organization has encountered being an African American based organization with a African American focus programmatic for us. The first thing I'd like to just let the audience know is that BFL has been unique in that it has its origin in a number of different places that all co-join together to become holistic in what we think is what community organizations serving primarily African Americans ought to be about. The first thing, before even forming the organization, there was some things that we wanted to lay at the foundation of Better Family Life. And that was one, that all of our members, which were volunteer in its initial stage, have a complete, thorough history as best they can and as best as we were able to articulate the history of Black America and the struggles from the enslavement days to emancipation to fighting over racism to the advancement era that was characterized by the NAACP and the Urban League and Booker T. Washington, to the conflicts that arose between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and et cetera. This dichotomy of thinking in terms of what is the best approach that African Americans ought to take for advancement, upliftment, and for liberation. Better Family Life were astute in going through that history. And then the other thing that was at the foundation of Better Family Life was a lot of the principles laid down by the Honorable Marcus Garvey, the Nation of Islam, and the Black Empowerment Movement that put the stress on cultural identity, self-improvement, and self-sufficiency. So taking all of that into a whole, Better Family Life also was the beneficiary of understanding that the student movement in America, which we are now seeing a replay on this whole issue of Gaza and genocide and all the rest of that, that students are becoming vocal. Well, back in the 1960s, the same thing was evident with the war in Vietnam and how students responded to that war. I was a student of that period, and so I infused a lot of thoughts of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and the student movement into the formation of Better Family Life. So with that rich background of historical analysis of present-day truth, et cetera, we were keenly aware that young people, students, if they could be integrated with veterans of the civil rights and the Black empowerment movement could bring about a change that would be helpful and beneficial to a community in need. So Better Family Life in 1983 began to organize with the acquisition of our state corporate identity, and then later on our 501c3 designation by the IRS and federal government. One of the things that we encountered right away was how difficult it was. It was easy navigating the state side of the not-for-profit designation, but it was extremely difficult navigating the federal 501c3. In addition to the difficulty, and we had a lawyer that worked with us, it still took around 9 months. My history of working in this area has shown me that many not-for-profits, this can go on for 2-3 years. So we were told that we were fortunate that it occurred in 9 months. Another part of the difficulty that we encountered was trying to get funded on the corporate side, the federal side, the city side, the state side. We did not initially have the credentials to be given, an entree into the capital markets, be they state agencies, city agencies, federal agencies, the philanthropic community, et cetera. We ran into a whole lot of problems. And one of the biggest problems was that as an African-American led organization, an African-American founded led organization, we did not have the blessings of some of those people who sit on those pockets of resources. And that was very frustrating, but part of how we were able to get around that was that we, again, as I said earlier, we had a self-sufficient model. So we took initiatives, fundraising initiatives from the Black church around tithing, that, if we can set aside 10% of our wages and resources and fund ourselves, we will be in a position to implement our programs. And we started in a very humble place in the basement of the home that I'm currently in. And we have grown from that basement to at its largest point to have a organization of 205 full-time employees working in 8 different locations throughout the St. Louis metropolitan area. And the metropolitan area in St. Louis includes both the Missouri side and the Illinois side, comprising of a total population of about 1.8 million people, with about Black Americans representing maybe 500,000 to 600,000 in the metropolitan area. So we have a large area. We have since, through struggle and just being persistent, we were able to receive federal dollars, state dollars, city dollars, corporate dollars, philanthropic dollars. We are a part of one national organization, Neighbor Works of America, which is the largest housing development training program in America, that has about 250 affiliates all over the country. Better Family Life has been privy to get training in housing development, which has enabled us to launch a national, a community-wide housing development program. So in the inner city of St. Louis, North St. Louis in particular, we are currently developing a major housing initiative on one of the boulevards that has been undeveloped for the last 40 or 50 years, Page Boulevard. We are the owners of a 60,000 square foot facility that we converted from a formal school to now be the house of the Better Family Life Cultural Education and Business Center. We offer programs in housing, as I talked about, youth development, cultural arts enrichment, workforce development, as well as neighborhood crime prevention programs and neighborhood organizing. We have been fortunate to develop Better Family Life in several cities across America, Washington, D.C., which Professor Alice Thomas played a major role in getting established, New Orleans, New York City, Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Monroe, North Carolina. As I said, I am the founder. I retired from my post 4 years ago, so I'm in retirement, but hopefully I will not stay in retirement long. My goal is to try to establish Better Family Life throughout the country. As I said, we have 4 cities now that's currently in operation, and hopefully we will expand that. I'm also the author of my first book, From the Projects to the Pyramid in Search of a Better Family Life. I will encourage everyone who's listening to get the book. You can get it on Amazon. It is a great read. It pretty much summarizes everything that I have just laid out in terms of the success. Better Family Life in St. Louis serve about 50,000 people annually in the programs that I mentioned. And we are just excited and been blessed to be around for 41 years. And I pray and hope that we can stay around, especially if the tax codes will stay favorable. And I know this panel will have to inform what needs to be done, what needs to be advocated in order to make that a reality. Thank you very much. And I turn the panel, I turn my time back over to Professor Alice Thomas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed, and thank you for sharing, and thank you for this journey that I joined you on as a young person back in 1983. So I'm very appreciative because I'm still on the journey.
Yes,
yeah, and I took to the Senate Finance Committee today. I took your journey to the Senate Finance Committee today. So praise be.
Very good.
Okay, very good. So we're gonna, and I'm sure people have lots of questions for you, but I'm gonna turn it over to Professor Brennen, who can talk to us from his perspective, because he spent his life's work working on behalf of tax-exempt organizations. He's one of the leaders in the Academy on this question. So Professor Brennen, what would you like to share? Time is yours.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say it's amazing that at age 25, you were around in 1983 to do all that work, Alice.
There you go. Keep it real. Keep it real.
You know, Dr. Ahmed, I'm really impressed with what you had to say. And I think that one aspect of what you have to say bears relevance to what I'm about to talk about. And that is this whole idea of funding ourselves, I think is the way you termed it, relating it to tithing. To what extent, if we're sort of self-sufficient, are we insulated, and are we able to do whatever we want to do when we fund ourselves, as opposed to relying upon direct financial support from the government? And that's sort of the central thesis for what I'm talking about. What I'm going to present is really an article that I'm working on entitled "Can Tax-Exempt Charities Lawfully Engage in Race-Based Affirmative Action After the SFAA v. UNC and Harvard case?" That case has a lot of personal relevance to me, because at the time the case was being litigated at the district court level, my son was actually a student at UNC Chapel Hill, and he's actually quoted in the opinion as one of those
Wow.
African Americans who may not be poor, as Judge Sotomayor says, but still suffers from racism because of the color of his skin. And that's really what motivated me to look deeper into this. And so the thesis that I'm working on is whether or not the SFAA case prevents folks who want to be, as Dr. Ahmed said, self-sufficient, whether they are still going to be subject to the dictates of some of the federal civil rights laws, particularly those that rely upon this concept of recipients of federal financial assistance. And to get to the heart of the matter does tax exemption itself under 501c3 equate with federal financial assistance? Well, the journey, the sort of issue arose as a result of the court's recent decision in the SFAA v. Harvard and UNC cases, where the court sort of said that we can no longer rely upon race-based affirmative action when we're making admissions decisions for public colleges and universities. So what I will do is talk about what the landscape was before the SFAA decision, what the landscape is after that decision, what types of private actors might be subject to the decision, and then talk a little bit about this whole issue of tax expenditures and what they are, and then get into the two issues related to that, and that is tax exemption the same as federal financial assistance, and or is it possible that that Bob Jones University case, also decided in 1983, can be a basis for restricting the activities of those who want to engage in race-based affirmative action, even if they are not direct recipients of federal financial assistance. So let's look at the landscape before the SFAA case. Before that case, as you recall, there was the University of Michigan cases involving the law school and the undergraduate school. The law school was very meticulous in how it considered race. It had a very elaborate system. Race was one factor among many that it used because the law school was a smaller admissions environment. The number of students enrolled was smaller. The admissions committee was smaller, and it could engage in some extensive assessment of each application pool. And although race was considered by the law school, it was considered as one factor among many. It wasn't a tipping factor necessarily. In contrast, though, the undergraduate school, which was much larger at Michigan, could not be as meticulous as the law school. And so the undergraduate school established a system where if you were an African American or had a minority characteristic that they were looking for, that actually could tip the scale in your favor in terms of your ability to be admitted to the undergraduate school. Now, the court said in the University of Michigan cases of Gratz and Grutter that because race was a deciding factor at the undergraduate school, then that was inappropriate. But because race was only one factor among many at the law school, that was okay. And this is a famous case where there's this footnote that said, well, we'll do this and it'll be good for about 25 years. And we'll see in 25 years if we still need to do this. Roll forward about 23 years later, and then we have the SFAA opinion. And that case was argued, I think, in 2022, decided in 2023, authored by Justice Roberts, who said, we haven't gotten to 25 years yet, but the clock has run out. He essentially said that we are now at a point where we need to be a colorblind society. Where even race as one factor among many is in 99% of the cases not going to be appropriate. I say 99% because he did leave the door open just a little bit. You may argue with whether it's 1% or 5%, but the door is still cracked a little bit, and I'll explain what that is in a second. And so Justice Roberts writing for the majority of the court, said, now that we have gotten through this stage in our evolutional development in our 250-year-old country, we no longer need to consider race. We need to be colorblind because that's what our founders intended. He left the door open by saying, if someone brings up race in their application and says that that is played some role in their struggles to become who they are, then that's okay. But we can't affirmatively seek out the race of applicants as universities and colleges, and we can't use that as a deciding factor in whether to admit. And so my issue is looking at the two litigants in the SFAA case. One was Harvard University, the other one was UNC, Chapel Hill. UNC is a public institution directly covered by the Equal Protection Clause, so there's no issue there. But Harvard is a private institution. And as Dr. Ahmed said, sometimes private actors want to be self-sufficient. So I hypothesized, just as the Supreme Court was doing in the recent case involving former President Trump, about hypothesizing what could happen in the future. Well, I was hypothesizing what could happen in the future if a 501c3 tax exemption decided, I don't want any money from the government. That is, if students enroll in my school, I won't accept their federal student loans. If my faculty members do research, I won't allow them to accept federal grants. In other words, what if a tax-exempt entity said, I will accept no direct money from the federal government. All I want is my 501c3 tax exemption or some other exemption under Section 501. Am I now subject to the Equal Protection Clause by way of Title VI? Because Title VI has been read to be equivalent to the Equal Protection Clause, but the only basis for Title VI to apply to a private actor is if that private actor is what's called a recipient of federal financial assistance. Well, looking at some of the case law on that, recipients of federal financial assistance typically have to get direct or indirect money from the federal government. It is not enough to forego the obligation to pay tax money to the federal government. And so what if that were the case? Would those types of entities, those that chose not to accept money from the federal government, be subject to the dictates of Title VI and hence Equal Protection Clause? And that's where my journey began. And one other thing that sort of prompted me to think about this is there is a recent Fourth Circuit opinion in which that very issue arose. You know, is tax exemption under 501c3 the equivalent of federal financial assistance? Now, that case was under Title IX, involving a private school that didn't accept any federal financial assistance, that was accused of sexual harassment of one of its students. And the school argued that Title IX did not apply because it did not receive any federal funds, either directly or indirectly. However, the plaintiffs claimed that Title IX did apply because they were 501c3 tax exempt. Well, the Fourth Circuit held that that tax exemption alone was not enough to be the equivalent of federal financial assistance. However, the U.S. Supreme Court has never decided that issue rather. Going back in history, there is a Supreme Court case that dealt with the issue of federal financial assistance and what it means, but it didn't deal with it in the context of whether or not tax exemption is federal financial assistance. And so this article that I'm writing talks about that line of cases going back to Grove City College up through the current case in 2024, and trying to figure out, or trying to predict rather, how the court would decide if it were faced with the issue of whether or not tax exemption alone is sufficient to be considered federal financial assistance. The second part of the thesis says that, well, even if we consider that federal financial assistance and tax exemption are distinguished enough so that they are not equivalent, that is, so that tax exemption is not the same as federal financial assistance, is it still possible for that old 1983 case to come up and say, well, even if it's not federal financial assistance under the Bob Jones public policy doctrine, if you engage in race-based affirmative action, you are necessarily violating an established public policy, because the Supreme Court has held that race-based affirmative action violates the Equal Protection Clause. Well, this is the part of the article that I'm actually working on now. And my preliminary thesis is that that is not necessarily the case. One thing about the Bob Jones case is that there have not been any courts to sort of take the ball and run with it in terms of the case's decision there. And so to the extent that we have a situation now where the Supreme Court has clearly said race-based affirmative action is violative of the Equal Protection Clause, Bob Jones tells us we have to look at all three branches of government to see if there's unanimity in terms of their views of whatever the policy issue is. In this case, I think the day of or day after the Bob Jones, the SFAA case was decided, President Biden announced the court was wrong. And so obviously the executive branch disagrees with the judicial branch in terms of whether or not race-based affirmative action is appropriate or inappropriate. And we have yet to hear from the legislative branch in terms of their views on this. So I would posit that there is not a situation like Bob Jones had when it came to discrimination against African Americans back in 1983 when it established the public policy standard, and therefore affirmative action based on race is not necessarily a violation of the public policy doctrine announced in Bob Jones. Where does this all get us? Well, it means that if you are a private school that chooses not to accept federal funds, I think that there is still a way for you to continue to engage in race-based affirmative action, because Title VI would not apply, and neither would the Equal Protection Clause, nor would the Bob Jones public policy doctrine prohibit you. Secondly, if you are what I call an admissions adjacent type entity, that is a 501c3 that maybe provides scholarships to African Americans, I still think that you are permitted to do that for the same reason, because there's no restrictions under Title VI, and there's no restrictions under the Bob Jones University public policy doctrine. So that's where I am. I'm still writing the article. I'm willing to be convinced that I'm wrong. In fact, if you read an article I wrote 20 years ago, I wrote something slightly different, sort of arguing against myself. So I'm very flexible, and we'll see if there are questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Brennen. That was really exciting and invigorating and challenging. And how do we get from point A to point B? And like you're arguing against yourself, even better. Because maybe you're going to win yourself against yourself this time, right? So
we'll see. I never win with my wife. Maybe I'll win with myself.
Well, your son is in the article. That's good. So I'm going to turn it over to Miss Professor Dean to talk about it. And then we can open it up for questions from the floor, because I know there are lots of questions. So everybody keep your questions and have them ready to roll when it's time to roll the questions, right?
Here we go. Thanks so much for having me today to talk about this project. I'm excited to hear from you after I speak for a bit. And I'm going to use slides. I use them as a crutch, but hopefully there'll be some value there. So I'm going to talk about a book that I'm working on currently, forthcoming with Oxford, hopefully later this year, beginning of next year. And it touches on the way race has shaped our international tax system. So the title, Global Jim Crow, I think will give you a sense of the direction I'm headed. All right, so let me see. All right, so you've been told, for those of you who are international folks or who have taken international tax, you learned about where our international tax system came from. You were basically told that the League of Nations looked around in the 1920s and said, this double taxation thing is very bad. We need a way to prevent it. And we are going to use these double tax treaties. We're going to develop a model. And these double tax treaties are going to save us from double taxation. This is sort of the standard view. And I'm going to point out some problems with this view, and we'll see where we go. All right. So the standard view is a little more nuanced than that. So Gratz, in his 2000 Tillinghast lecture, says that we basically have a system that dates to 1928. So before the League's model was created in 1928, we had the foreign tax credit created all the way back in 1918. So we had a different system for avoiding double taxation already in place, very generous. Again, those of you who are international experts will understand the difference between a treaty-based system and a foreign tax credit-based system. Essentially, what the U.S. did near the tail end of World War I was say, other countries, you go ahead, you collect the revenue. We don't need it. It's fine. You just keep it. That'll be great. We're very happy with that result. We don't need the money. We're the U.S. We're doing fine. You guys had a tough war. You need the money. But when you look at when treaties actually came into existence, I was just reading this paper. This is a paper by Omri Marion and Elliot Ash that I was reading for a workshop, and I was really struck by this chart. And their chart was not about, I'm not suggesting their article was about what I'm thinking about. Their article was just about where the text of treaties comes from, whether the UN model or the OECD model is more, or the US model is more impactful. But I was really struck by this graph, which shows that there are a lot of treaties now, thousands of these treaties, and there were quite a few in 2000 and 1980, and just a handful in 1960, and almost none in 1940. And certainly the timeline that Gratz suggests, or that the conventional wisdom suggests, that starting at the very beginning, we were treaty-based, or even that we started in 1928 with the treaty-based system, is actually not the case. So even though the League created the model in 1928, there really were not very many for quite some time. So the question that I'm grappling with is, why the U.S. would have embraced a very generous system that basically says to other countries, you guys go ahead and keep the money. We don't need it. We're the U.S. We don't need all that money. And then why the about face? Why double tax treaties became very popular starting in the 1950s and 1960s. So I look at the date of the OECD Charter, and I do believe in coincidences, but I'm not totally sure that everything that happens at the same time is a coincidence. So this is the very same day that the OECD Charter was signed. So the OECD used to be the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, sort of a Marshall Plan entity formed after World War II. And in 1960, it was transformed, apparently making it a global organization by adding the US and Canada. About 4 years later, Japan was added. But when it was formed, this was an all-white organization. And what it did, so it formed on the same day that the UN's General Assembly issued its declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and people, right? So this is two things happening on the very same day, which may or may not be related. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. I've drawn mine. All right, so one story you've heard about the rise of the OECD, or the role of the OECD, is that it is sort of the expertise, the world's tax experts. That is what they are there for. But at the very beginning, when the OEEC, again, before the US and Canada were formally added, when it started doing tax work, it had no tax expertise. And in fact, at one of the first meetings, one of the experts from the UN, which at the time was the world's tax expert, very generously offered to help them out. How about we offer you guys some tax expertise so you guys can get up to speed like we are over here at the UN? So, that's another another problem with our understanding of the world. All right, so if we didn't turn to the OECD because of their tax expertise, of which they had none when they started doing their tax work, and it wasn't true that we always had treaties, or certainly always had them starting in the 1920s, why exactly did we start getting them all in the 1950s and 1960s? So I learned a lot by doing this work, and the answer that I came to very much surprised me, and I think will surprise the editors at Oxford when I send in my manuscript, which is a little bit different than the proposal they had a few years ago. So everybody here on this call, I assume, has taken an economics class, or maybe read the Wall Street Journal. and knows this fellow, John Maynard Keynes. So when John Maynard Keynes in the post-World War II era was describing a UN conference for that the US insisted on holding and inviting a wide range of countries to, that was going to help create the World Bank and the IMF, he was actually not a big fan of this conference. And he actually described it as the most monstrous monkey house assembled in many years. He was not a fan. And the problem he had was that the conference organizer, the US, had organized it, had invited a wide range of countries, including Liberia and Ethiopia. And he just did not think that these countries were countries that should be participating in this kind of global international economic lawmaking. So you have two views of what was happening in the 1950s and 1960s when Africa was decolonizing. So you had India decolonizing in 1947, Indonesia around the same time. So you had decolonization happening in other parts of the world in the 1940s. By the late 1950s, it was Africa's turn. And so the first leader of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, insisted that the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. I think Keynes probably had a different view. And when you look at the history, so I'm quoting here an historian from Yale who talked about the reaction to decolonization in Europe and North America. And they were specifically concerned about increased taxation and how, when you no longer have the direct colonial control that you had to be able to prevent these colonies from creating schools and hospitals, which they in fact did as colonies, how do you prevent them from spending that money when they're independent? And luckily, or unluckily, depending on your perspective, the League of Nations had in fact created these treaties, which were very unfriendly to source countries. And the US was able to shift power from the UN, which at this time had been very pro-source, and had been trying to deepen and strengthen the pro-source protections in global tax policy. And you switch to the OECD, which is controlled by Europe and North America, and turns very hostile to the idea of source taxation as a way of preventing these newly independent states like Ghana from collecting the taxes that Europe was able to collect thanks to the US subsidy after World War I and after World War II, I will mention, and that other newly sovereign countries were able to collect in turn in the 1940s and early 1950s. What does that have to do with the world now? So I'll share that I grew up in the Bahamas, so I like palm trees and coconut trees, but that is not why I have this. That's not why I have this tree in my presentation. The point that I'm making with the book is that the choices that were made in the 1950s and 1960s to shift power from the UN to the OECD, to take away power from these newly independent countries, to make the global tax system more aggressive, was in fact bad at the time. It has done a lot of damage to a lot of countries that have never quite recovered from this shift. But there are still problems today with having an organization in charge of global tax policy, the UN, that to this day has still never had a majority Black member, has still never had an African member. And for those of you who are paying attention, by 2050, a quarter of the world's population will be African. And unless something dramatic changes, they will have no representation at the OECD. They will not be a member of the OECD at all. So they'll have no voice. So what does this have? What does this coconut tree have to do with that? You'll remember the OECD's two-pillar proposal. This palm tree is from the 2021 brochure that they published announcing that. So pillar 2 here, they illustrate it by showing a parent company in country A, an operating sub in country B, and they show the low tax jurisdiction. They, at this point, have been told they couldn't say tax haven. So they use the more polite term low tax jurisdiction, but they want to make sure they're understood when they're blaming countries like my own country, the Bahamas, for what they see as a problem. So they not only include the sun, they include the blue water that I know so well. I see the nice beach there, and they have the coconut trees as well. Of course, those of you who pay close attention to this know that when the U.S. and other experts talk about tax havens, they're not talking exclusively or even primarily about tropical islands. They're talking about Switzerland, Ireland, Luxembourg. Of course, the double Irish Dutch sandwich does not mention, for good reason, the Bahamas or any other tropical islands. You still have a situation in which global tax policy is being made in a system that is racially exclusive. And that has had very negative consequences. Those of you who are plugged into the system know that the UN has recently weighed in again and have tried to shift the power, reclaim the power they lost in the 1950s, 1960s to the OECD. And, I think there is a lot of reason to be optimistic, cautiously optimistic about the prospects for making global tax policy in an inclusive way where all parts of the globe are represented, not having a global tax system that is made by countries that exclude an entire continent. So I will stop there and just say that if you have any questions, I would be very happy to receive them by email, but also right now. So I will stop sharing.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Dean. That was like incredible. Again, I think it brings to mind Dorothy Brown, The Whiteness of Wealth, right? What seems very innocuous, very simple, very non-race specific, underneath it is very race specific. Like you're talking about this OECD and the United Nations and how these Black countries and Black islands kind of get the brunt of it and get hit by it. But yet you dress it up like it's just not. It's a really fair season, a fair system, and it's not fair at all. So thank you so much for bringing this out and highlighting this for us. I can't wait to see your book. I can't wait.
Thank you so much.
So, and I think if I go back to Malik Ahmed and David Brennen and you, there's a theme through all of this, because Malik Ahmed is talking about self-sufficiency and going back to lifting up the Black voice and Black experience from enslavement through post-enslavement, early Jim Crow, but how we had to do that, how we had to survive. And when David's talking about right here, it goes all the way back to Bob Jones. And before that moment, here we go again. And then you say, here on the international side, here we go again. The fact that there were no treaties, and then all of a sudden, the spike of treaties, right? And it's Switzerland, it's Sweden, whatever, all these other really tax havens is not, poor little Bahamas, let's beat up Bahamas. Why are we beating up Bahamas?
And I will say the Bahamas is not, they're not innocent.
I didn't say innocent.
I grew up learning about all the pirates we had back in the day. We've been naughty before.
Yeah, I know, but it's not about innocence or whatever. But thank you so much. So I'm going to open it up to see if anyone in the community has a question for us. And if not, we can then take it from there. Anybody has a question in the chat?
While the chat, people are maybe raising their hand in the chat. I wanted, Stephen, when we were having a planning call, you mentioned the Dunning School in the early 20th century and the Reconstruction theory. So do you want to just address that a little bit? Because I found that fascinating.
Sure. So this is one of the big surprises. Thank you, Nina. One of the big surprises for me working this book. So the original title of the book was Taxation is Freedom. And I thought that everything that happened here was just an accident. Everybody meant well. These treaties were wonderful. And look at this horrible consequence that they had. And I was very surprised to learn, and this is something that I actually learned quite recently, So those who have thought a lot about international tax will probably recognize the name Seligman. So Seligman was one of the 4 economists who, under the League of Nations auspices, helped create the Model Tax Treaty. So I was looking into Seligman's background, and it turns out that Seligman was also one of the core members of what's known as the Dunning School. So this was a group of scholars at Columbia University who were very good at history and all their disciplines, but they were apologists for the Confederacy. And they created a narrative around the end of the Civil War. So after the Civil War, Reconstruction tried to empower Blacks to bring them into the nation's civic life, to make them able to vote, to serve in office. And this, in fact, happened for a while. So Virginia sent its first member of Congress to Congress 100 years before somebody was elected again in the 1870s. But there was a time when it actually worked. But Reconstruction faltered, and the reason that it faltered was that the Ku Klux Klan began a wave of extreme terror, and there was a lot of fraud on behalf of the white minority in a lot of these states. And the story that Seligman and the other members of the Dunning School told was that what happened to the Reconstruction was that Blacks were very bad at governing. And so the story you hear John Maynard Keynes sharing was really the heart of what the Dunning School had convinced the world of. There's a textbook, and you can't make this stuff up. There was a textbook that some of you actually probably used, a newer version of it, thankfully, when you're in high school, The American Pageant. In 1956, a textbook was published by a Stanford University professor who actually said that after the Civil War, Blacks were so lost and incompetent that scores of them actually, after the Civil War, just lay down and died because they didn't know what to do. So this is the story that the Dunning School told, and that was at the time that the treaties took off and Africa was decolonizing. This was in high school textbooks. I mean, this is just in high school textbooks. This is not, fringe stuff. This is a textbook written by a Stanford professor. The Dunning School experts were all at Columbia University, including, again, one of the 4 economists, Seligman. And when you understand that perspective, you begin to understand why the world was very concerned about what would happen when Ghana decolonized and Nigeria decolonized and Kenya decolonized. They weren't just greedy. There was greed, but there'd always been greed. There was real fear that these nations would do what Blacks had done during Reconstruction, or what the Dunning School had persuaded them that Blacks had done during Reconstruction. So you really have to, and I'm very surprised by what I found, and I hope that others will be open to hearing this really quite surprising information about a system that we all thought we knew, and quite frankly, about people we thought we knew. I think people imagine, even historians, tax historians who study Seligman, tell a very different story about him than the evidence suggests. And I think it's time to do that work and figure that out.
Excellent, excellent. So do we have any more questions from the floor?
I just posed a question in the chat. I was curious for Dean Brennen. You mentioned some of the issues that might connect to what I think you refer to them as admission adjacent organizations. I may have the term wrong. I'm interested if maybe you could expand a bit more on some of the issues that might apply to those groups. I'm thinking primarily those that might be kind of focusing on providing scholarships to traditionally underrepresented groups in education.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that's what sort of prompted me to sort of expand. One of the things I'm going to do in the article, in part 2 of the article, I'm going to actually talk about some of these private parties beyond simply colleges and universities, because we need to see sort of who could be implicated. Although the opinion is framed as applying to admissions into colleges and universities, I'm sure we could see some logical expansions. For example, I could see this applying to elementary and high school admissions for private schools as one expansion. A further expansion might be, scholarships that are granted to students who, even if they're granted admission, they're not going to enroll because they don't have the money. And so if your scholarship is race-based, is this a way of kind of getting around what the Supreme Court was trying to do? And so again, if I'm trying to see what's the logical nexus of what I call admissions adjacents. Now, one of the things I did not do is I did not delve into the world of how does this apply to race-based decisions in the workplace, for example. I think there's been some prognostication that this opinion is forming the basis for saying that race-based affirmative action and hiring might be next on the chopping block, and the court didn't talk about that. So I'm not going to really go into that in great detail. I'm going to try to center on things that relate to admissions and sort of getting into the educational sphere. But I think that you can really, if you were to take everything to its logical next step, you can get bigger and bigger and bigger.
And I'll just say that I'm on a board of a tax-related nonprofit that does some outreach, has some diversity fellowships and that sort of thing. And there's been some real pushback, even in that space, fear because of the decision. I think a lot of anticipatory shutting down of options. So the work that Dean Brennen is doing is really important because I think people are inclined to panic.
Yep. And let me say one other thing, which I probably should have said in my introduction. I'm going to be chair of the ABA Council starting in August, and we're dealing with this issue in terms of law schools nationally. Nothing I said here has to do anything with my official role as chair of the ABA Council. So let me get that disclaimer out there.
We appreciate that disclaimer, but as you're talking about the adjacent spaces where this may extend into, because one of the spaces I've looked in is like that Fearless Fund, where they were sued because they're making grants for Black women business owners, right? And oddly, when I look down, they're using 42 USC section 1981, the federal statute from the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And the notion that we're even dealing with that today, we thought that was well settled. It is not so well. We're really being sued because we are actually working on behalf of Black people because we thought we were supposed to. Now we're being sued out of that space. And so I think a lot of nonprofits who are Black nonprofits and others similarly situated are feeling threatened because then you got to get lawyers to represent you in these litigations. I just may not have the money to do the litigation. So I think we have a lot of work to do here.
I think that's a really important point, what Steve was saying about the, the chilling effect, the shutting down options. I think Jim Alm has his hand up. Jim?
Fascinating discussion from all three of the panelists. Here's a quick question for my good friend Stephen Dean. If in fact the tax making apparatus was more inclusive and included in OECD and, for that matter, in other international organizations, more African country representation, how do you think things would change? How would international tax policy change? And how would you like to see international tax policy change?
No, it's a fair question, and I'll answer it in two ways. The first question is, what would have happened back in the 50s if the UN didn't lose its role in global tax policy making? So to be clear, there was no vacuum that the OECD stepped into. The OECD kicked the UN out. It's a little oversimplification, but that was definitely what was happening. And I'll just tell you a story that this incredible scholar from Australia, Nikki Teo, a junior scholar, very talented, from a book she just published about a year ago on the history of the UN and tax, which is where I'm getting a lot of this information from. I was happy that while I was writing this book, she published the book because I had speculated that this was true, and then she's like, "No, it's all true, Steve. Go ahead." So what the UN had been working on had really scared the US, quite frankly, was a proposal to really supercharge source taxation, right? So the credit system is pretty friendly to source jurisdictions, but the UN wanted to take this much further because it has this really progressive cross-border dynamic where if you allow source countries to keep more tax revenues, they're able to develop and sustain that development. And the US was getting very nervous because more and more countries from the global south were entering the UN. And so on this one committee vote, when this proposal what the UK apparently called this proposal, and I use it as a term of endearment, they did not mean it that way, was the old Cuban tax gambit, because Cuba kept proposing this. So Cuba kept proposing this very pro-source measure, and the US was very nervous that the Soviet Union was on this panel as well, in this committee, and they thought that with the number of developing countries on the committee and the Soviet Union was going to support source taxation, and it was going to be curtains for sort of residence taxation. And it turns out the Soviet Union just thought this was all some sort of corporate scam, and they didn't want anything that might benefit multinationals, so they did not support it. But this was sort of as close as the global south came to getting this sort of super source taxation they were looking for in the 50s. So I do think I think the US felt like it dodged a bullet at that point, and thought that, when Ghana was not yet part of the UN when this happened. There were a lot of these African countries about to come into the UN, and that was the moment where a combination of greed and fear really motivated them to bring the OECD up to speed, to again transform it from the OEEC to the OECD, to globalize it, and put them in charge of global tax policy. When I've taught a seminar based on this book, I've done that twice now, and I have a habit of getting really just overly optimistic. And so I tell my students, if only this hadn't happened, everything would be fine. And they just look at me like, what is wrong with you, Professor Dean? There are just so many ways for things to go wrong, and for justice to not be served. So I think that there was a possibility that things could have gone very differently back then, but that's just me being naive. Today, I think that I'm not so naive as to think that the UN is just a white knight charging in to save us all from harm. It's a complicated institution that has not done a perfect job of, frankly, anything. But I do think that at least creating an organization that's in charge of tax policies that affect everybody around the world, that, again, this is very my own personal perspective, that knows what a coconut looks like on a tree, right? Those coconuts I showed you in that picture, the brochure, that's a grocery store coconut. That is not what coconuts look like on a tree. So when whoever did that image needs to do some homework, right? Because I think if you're going to create sort of a racially charged piece of propaganda, I guess maybe if everybody looking at it doesn't know what a real coconut looks like, you have to use the grocery store coconut and pretend that they're back in the tree. But I think having an organization in charge that has some knowledge of what the rest of the world's needs are would be a good start. So I think of sort of the notion of first do no harm, and I think that at least having an organization that understands what the needs of an entire continent, I think that would be very helpful.
So Stephen, how do we get that conversation before the right people to raise up the interest from the continent?
Oh, you're going to be very surprised by this. So the Biden administration voted against that General Assembly resolution to create a global tax convention in November. So the Biden administration is actively opposing empowering the UN. The Biden administration is actively doing that right now. So there are a bunch of folks on this call who are very connected. And if you think that the organization in charge of the world's tax policy should be one that has never had an African member or a majority Black member. If you think that's a problem, you should reach out and have a nice talk with anybody you know who has any influence in the Biden administration. Luckily, the OECD all voted against it. Not luckily that, but luckily the OECD voted against the UN Global Tax Convention. But there are not that many of them, as it turns out. You know, the OECD is not very representative. So even if everybody from the UN or from the OECD votes against this change, they're going to be vastly outvoted, and they were. But you know, having the U.S. oppose this is really disappointing to me. Is it disappointing? No, actually, given what I've learned, it's not disappointing. But it is. It's unfortunate. It's. I think the U.S. is putting itself on the wrong side of history here, and you know, it's going to look bad. It's really going to look bad for us when we go down opposing democracy. I think that is not a good look.
We did a tax chat, and I want to say it was back in 2021 with an academic from Switzerland who did some anthropological work at OECD as Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 were being negotiated. And I'll link that or send it out in the next reminder about the next tax chat we have, because her research is really interesting, and I'll try to find the articles that she's written about it, you know, about the conversation, you know, what was happening in the room, and then what was happening as these conversations were happening separately, and what people were saying separately, recognizing the powers that were talking in the room. It's very interesting research.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
So I have a question.
Yes.
So Malik, Mr. Ahmed, I'm really curious if there were one thing you could change about the process that you went through that you think would really help the kind of organizations that you helped create. What would that be? Is there one thing you could imagine changing? I know you mentioned the difficulty related to filing when we spoke earlier. I'm just curious if you had a magic wand that could change one thing, what would that be?
So I think probably the greatest thing that I would like to change or should be changed is the entree into the 501c. That it should be a very simple process, especially for organizations that have very little revenue and very little experience. It should not be so many barriers, because what those barriers do is prevent them from ever entering into it. The time frame should not be no more than 90 days. The communication between the IRS and those organizations should be rapid, and it should be very personal. It is so impersonal that you can almost get lost in the generality of what is being communicated. Very key things are being communicated, but they're communicated in a way that it is very difficult to understand. It may mean be that you need a signature on page 3, but it will be sent in a way that, you know, tons of paper telling you what you are not qualified for, so that you never get to the meat of what you need to do. So I would think that simplifying the process, especially for organizations that don't have much resources to start. Thank you for the question.
You know, Alice is going to know what I'm going to say about this, but you know, I originally recommended in 2011, when I was the National Taxpayer Advocate, that the IRS create an easy form of the application for the 501c3 status. And at that time, they said, oh, no, we can't do this because our job is to regulate the exempt sector, and we want to make sure that everybody is doing it properly. And then they got so far behind in the application process that they decided, well, they needed to create this 1023EZ, and what they ended up doing is making it basically this dumbed down form that anybody and their brother can get a 501c3 with. But the important thing is that the New York Times did an article a couple of years ago showing that this one gentleman had created basically 87 501c3s, all with the name American Cancer Society of, Wichita and the American Cancer Society, and all of them had the same address in the Bronx. So that they were clearly, it was clearly fraudulent. So they've gone from one extreme to another, but to Malik's point, there is no one giving personal assistance to these exempt organizations. There's no one saying, well, tell us what you're doing, write your description of what you're doing, and then we can talk to you about what, how you need to organize or things like that, or whether you have the right language in your articles of incorporation. There's no real interpersonal interaction. So the IRS, for the smallest organizations, has just walked away from any kind of, to my mind, assistance, and also governance, oversight of them, to make sure that you don't have fraudulent ones out there that then tar the legitimate ones that are trying to do things. I do have a question for you, though, Malik, which is that, when we were on our planning call, you talked a lot about self-sufficiency and self-determination, both in the Southern and African countries. But I think can you talk a little bit about your organization, how you really focused on that self-sufficiency and self-determination?
Well, like I said, when we first started out, because we could not get any funding from the broader community, we self-funded, and we tied weekly. And from our tithing, we were able to put on a variety of community-based cultural focused programs, dance festivals, Kwanzaa celebrations, family gatherings, etc. And that enabled us to start speaking to a much broader community, and also get publicity about the various events that we were putting on: radio publicity, television publicity, newspaper, etc. And from that publicity, we then began to create a following. So not only were people giving us monies, we were also able to sell products at a variety of these festivals. So in the early years, that was the funding. And then some arts dollars then start filtering in the mid-1980s, and on and on and on until we got the legitimacy. I think that once people start seeing that we were impacting thousands of people, there was no way that they can say that, you're not making an impact. And so, that, and also I should add that prior to us becoming a staff organization, it was an all volunteer organization. Volunteerism is something that's dear to my heart. I am a former Peace Corps volunteer that served 3 years in West Africa in the 1970s. So I knew enough about volunteering and community organizing and all of those essential qualities to galvanize people to look at specific kinds of problems in the African American community. I hope I answered your question. Okay.
So I would say too that my experience and what I watched and witnessed was that we were able to build that connection to the community, where we got your attention through the cultural arts. Once we had your attention through the cultural arts, the dance, the Kwanzaa, the exciting things, right? Then we had substantial lecturers who came and talked about really consequential issues, kind of similar to Dean Brennen and Professor Dean, similar substantial conversations that people didn't know what they walked into until they walked in the room. And once we had them in the room, we had them. And then we got you on the journey of better family life.
And Alice, let me also say this. When Professors Stephen Dean and David Brennen was talking, my head was swelled up because the information was so powerful. It's like, my gosh, you think that you know a subject matter in terms of all of its ramifications, and then you're introduced to a whole nother level of what this struggle is all about. And so, keeping people tuned into the struggle, this fight is not just a local fight, but it's a global fight. And it's a fight that we will be in for the rest of our lives. So I really appreciate it. And I want to get both of your books and see how we can bring you into St. Louis so that you can share this information, because very few people know. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, Dr. Ahmed, can you imagine what would happen if all of these organizations that are having trouble figuring out how to fill out a 1023 and create a 501c3, all of a sudden realize that once you form it, now you're subject to Title VI, Title IX, and all the other civil statutes out there that were meant to protect Black people.
I know, it's amazing.
Yes.
Or worse, are persuaded by the chilling effect that they should not do it. I mean, that's
exactly
even worse.
Exactly.
They might fear that they're subject to more than they are.
Exactly. And I would just say, I've had the luxury and the opportunity of teaching it for 31 years now, praise be to God, but mostly at HBCUs, right? UDC and Howard. And I started the first nonprofit class at UDC and the first nonprofit class at Howard. Because my point was I had to bring the bigger community into the conversation. I said, because at some point you're going to be approached by those small people in your community, small nonprofits, to help them get their 501c3, deal with their charitable solicitation challenges at the state level. And I need you to have some information so that you can actually work on behalf of these people and help lift them to do their work. But now we got chilling effects. Now, should we be that Black organization? Should we work for the Black women, the Black girls, the Black men? Are we going to be sued? So what should we do? So I just think that we're in a whole new landscape, but we don't give up. We don't stand down. We just lean in. I bring Charles Hamilton, Houston, wherever I go. I just lean in even harder because I'm not going to stand back. And I don't know, David, how have you processed, Dean Brennen, how have you processed? I'm at an HBCU law school where I'm challenged in my admissions. They can't use race. We, the admissions committee, can't view race at Howard. And so we're struggling with this. So where do you think we're going with this, Dean Brennen? How are we going to get out of this hole?
That's an excellent question. I've often struggled with this, especially when you consider that there is sort of a carve out for the military academies. Why no carve out for HBCUs? That would seem to make the most sense. But here we are. It's tough. I mean, I sort of pundit on my role as chair of the ABA Council, but we're really struggling with that for HBCUs and really all law schools. As you know, legal education is something where we have segments of our society that aren't represented. So if we can't consider race in the admissions process, how do we fulfill our obligation to really make sure that there's opportunities for folks throughout society to gain a law degree and really represent people in those communities where there's only African Americans available to potentially represent them. But if we don't have them as lawyers, they won't have that type of representation. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I do recognize that it is profound.
Right. And I think, are we about 6% of lawyers are Black lawyers, correct? About 6%. So we can't consider race. And then we're trying to get Black males in the law school, which are always the underrepresented population. It's just like, wow. And I also think like at Howard is very personal to me. Howard University was set up right after we got out of enslavement for the express purpose of educating formerly enslaved people. So now I can't use race. Like my race was not cloaked when I got out of enslavement, but now I got to cloak my race. I just think it's odd. And it's because people making these decisions don't think and feel like us. They aren't us making these decisions. Because if you would ask me, I said, hold up, you can't do that. No, 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 no.
Well, and I
No,
think,
no.
Professor Thomas, I think part of the problem, and this is what I've been finding looking into the history of it, is, I think it's very easy to misunderstand or to mischaracterize the facts and the history that have brought us here. And so you highlighting the original purpose of Howard, I think, in telling the story of what it was for, is really, it's highly relevant. I mean, this is really important, and I think it's to imagine this sort of sanitized past where blacks just thought it might be nice to have a school for themselves. It's actually, I'm giggling because it's so horrible that I can't help it. But it's this ahistorical approach to the world is really unfortunate.
And I encourage anyone who has an interest in this issue of race and tax, the topic of this panel, to really read carefully the opinion of Justice Roberts in the SFAA case. Right. It speaks of colorblindness in a way that's just mind-boggling, because I thought we were beyond that, but apparently we're not.
All right, so I'm being asked to talk about a little bit of my own personal history. We mentioned in our planning ceremony, you asked me to bring it up. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from St. Louis. So when we took our elementary trips, we went into the city. I grew up in St. Louis County, which is a separate jurisdiction from the city, one of the 2 or 3 places in the country where the city and counties don't overlap. They're separate jurisdictions. They took us down to the courthouse in St. Louis, where Dred Scott was litigated and decided, right? And so in elementary school, I kept going. I was like, who are these people? Who is Dred Scott and his wife? And what was this about? And so I have always been impacted by the Dred Scott family and that decision, because I grew up with it, right? So I've always wondered, as I grew up into an adult who eventually ended up at Howard Law School, I went to Washington University in my elementary school. And I tell you about that because it was a predominantly white institution in St. Louis called the Harvard of the Midwest, but it was a top school, right? But then we went to a carnival, and we walked past the carnival and we looked to our right, and there were white folks in blackface. And we were like, say, what? They're blackface up in here. What is going on? Oh my God, they think it's funny. These enslaved people are now the comic of your routine, right? So I left WashU and I came to Howard and did my JD MBA here at Howard, because I met my husband in undergrad. He went to Howard Med School and I went to law and graduate business, but we were tired of fighting for the right to protest to get the same education white folks got. I said, I'm going to HBCU. I'm just going to stand down. I'm going to spend my time building my professional self, right? So my thing is, I've always wondered where that deep part of my heart, there's always a fighter. Where did I grow that fight? I think it happened way back in that courthouse in St. Louis, looking at Dred Scott, because they now built it up now. It's a real museum with lots of stuff. And you learn that Dred Scott and his wife were just one group, one couple who fought that fight for their freedom. But there were like 100 other people in that same fight that we didn't even know about. They were in that same fight. So my thing is, I think that history is relevant because it keeps me focused on my goal and my direction and what I'm doing and what choices I'm making. So I just want to be the voice of the voiceless. I want to be there to help in that space. So when I was saying that I went to the Senate Finance Committee majority to talk to them this morning, it was taken with a great deal of respect and appreciation. Here it is, I have an opportunity to present issues in a way that they normally probably may not receive them, right? And they were very receptive to what I had to say. And I'm very thankful to Nina and Fred Goldberg as well, who supported me on that journey to get to that place, to be there to share my perspective, which was received. But it's really giving that other point of view, because I mentioned that woman, that nonprofit, the Fearless Fund. I said, they're being sued, by the way. And what are we going to do about this? And what are we going to do about all these different things that on the surface, as Professor Dean mentioned may not in of itself look like an issue of race, but when you look underneath it, it was all about race. You know, it was all about race. We just have to call it to the surface and be honest about it. If we're not down with, we don't believe in it, then we need to push back from it. Like, as you're saying that President Biden's administration were pushing against the very things that Mr. Professor Dean was talking about. We're trying to get through. We got to be honest. It's like, you know, what's up? You say you're down with this. Are you going to come to the table and support us? Or do you realize you're not supporting us and working against our agendas? So, but I'm going to keep the fight up. Just won't quit.
I have no doubt that Alice is going to keep the fight up. And we've come to 3:30, and I think, you know, this has been such an important conversation. And I love just the line, "What's up?" Just calling people out for, you know, what's just very, I don't even know the word for it, what David was describing about the opinion, the SFAA language in there is just eye-opening. And I agree that everyone should read it, and it's on our resource page. I want to thank everybody on this panel and the entire audience for participating in this conversation. We've learned a lot. You know, we'll let everybody know when the books come out or the article comes out, but there's lots of stuff on our resource page, and we'll add some more. And I just, you know, our next chat is going to be on May 8th. And again, we'll send out a notice to everybody who's registered. But I just want to thank you all for doing this. This has been just an extraordinary conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you all. Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everybody.
All right, take care.
Thank you.